I'll begin by saying that my background is not art history, it is scientific research, specifically geoscience research. So when I was asked to study a number of mostly landscape watercolors and drawings from the Stewart collection, my role was to see what we could learn by studying the actual landscapes. Initially, the title of this watercolor was Lake in North Italy. We did not know at that time that this is Lake Como. So the focus of this presentation is to show you how we determine that it is Lake Como and how we identified the exact location of the artist when he sketched this landscape using a tool called Google Earth Studio. So this is a watercolor by John Warwick Smith titled Lake in North Italy, Lake Como, dated about 1778. As I mentioned, we did not initially know that this is Lake Como. This was the very first case study that I worked on, and I can remember walking into Dina Woodall's office. She showed me an image of this watercolor and said, "Craig, I think this might be of Lake Como. Could you research it and to figure out if in fact it is Lake Como?" I really wasn't sure how to do this, and then Melinda Naro, the curatorial assistant, said, "Craig, why don't you try using Google Earth?" And so I did. Now, Google Earth had limited functionality, so later on I discovered a tool called Google Earth Studio, which I'll talk a lot more about in this presentation. So the very first thing you need to do in any kind of study like this is to characterize what it is you see in the watercolor. And what I see is a lake. I see a tall hill to my right and a much smaller hill to my left, and both of them have buildings on them. I see directly in front of me what I will call a flat plain, or maybe it's a very broad valley floor, but I can see far into the distance. And in the distance I see two mountain peaks. The peak on the left seems to have actually multiple peaks, at least two I can see. And then the one on the right may have just a single peak, but is also partially blocked by the hill. Now we're going to use this very brief and simple description to help us to determine whether or not this landscape that we see in this watercolor is of Lake Como. Now one of the reasons that we thought this might be Lake Como is based on a watercolor that is in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum by Francis Towne, titled View of Lake Como, dated 1781. Francis Towne and John Warwick Smith were fellow British artists, and they traveled together through northern Italy at this time. Now I want you to look at this watercolor and also look at our description on the left of the watercolor by John Warwick Smith. First of all, there's a tall hill to the right and a smaller hill to the left. There's a broad flat plain in the middle where we can see well beyond to some mountains, tall mountain peaks. The one on the left has multiple peaks, and the one on the right is partially hidden by the hill and has a single peak. So this is not just of Lake Como, it is also of an almost identical view as what we see in the watercolor by John Warwick Smith. But where exactly on Lake Como were these artists when they sketched these landscapes? This image on the right is from a tool called Google Earth Studio, which you'll learn much more about later. We're looking straight down at Lake Como from an altitude of about 150 kilometers. The four numbers are four possible locations for these artists, and the arrows are pointing the direction that they would have been looking. Now I think you can see the mountains and the hills and the valleys on this image, so look down any one of those directions where the arrow's pointing, and ask yourself the question, do I see a broad flat plain in front of me? Is there a tall hill to my right and a smaller hill to my left? Are there mountain peaks in the distance? So take a second and look at these four locations and ask yourself, is one or maybe two of these locations more likely to be the artist's location than the others? And then we're going to look at all four of the locations. Now, location number one is a very broad glacial valley. And this is what they would have been looking down if they were looking down this valley. And you can see there's a tall hill to the right, but there's also one to the left. And there are tall mountains in the distance, but nothing that looks like what we see in the watercolor. And so though this is a broad valley floor, it is not the artist's location. So now let's look at location number 2. And here you're looking up one of several mountain valleys that slope down to the lake. And as you will see, it's definitely not the artist's location. Though there is a tall hill to the right, there's a tall hill to the left. It is not a broad valley, it's a very narrow valley. It's a winding valley, and it tends to slope upward towards the mountains. And you can see a mountain in the distance, but certainly not the mountains that you see in the watercolor. Now location number 3 is at the very end of the lake, and if you look at the arrow on the right, there seems to be a tall hill, and on the left maybe a shorter hill. Maybe that's a broad plain, and we're looking towards something that looks like a hill. So maybe this is the location. So let's have a look at it. And what you see is a tall hill on the right, a shorter hill on the left, a fairly broad area in between, in which you can see down, but you don't see two mountain peaks. Instead, you see what looks like a hill. So though this does resemble what we see in the watercolor, it isn't correct because the mountains aren't there. So now let's look at the last location, which is at the very end of the other arm of the lake, and we're looking toward Switzerland. It seems like there's a tall hill to our right and maybe a shorter hill on our left and a broad plain, and since we're looking towards Switzerland, maybe there are mountains in the distance. And there are. This is the location. The town is called Chernobyl. And John Warwick Smith and likely Francis Towne were standing on the opposite shore of the lake, or maybe on a boat very near the opposite shore, looking toward Chernobyl when they sketched these landscapes. But where exactly was John Warwick Smith, and what exactly was he looking at? To determine that, we're going to use a tool called Google Earth Studio. Google Earth Studio is an online application. It is very much like Google Earth, but it has many more capabilities, and you have to ask permission to use it. This is Google Earth Studio. What you see here is the image that we were just looking at of Chernobyl. There are 6 controls that we are going to use, 3 to control the artist's location and 3 to control what they are looking at. The 3 that control the artist's location are longitude, latitude, and altitude. I'm going to first move the artist down to get him closer to the level of the lake. And then I'm going to adjust latitude to move them a little bit down the shoreline. And I'm looking now on the side at an image of the watercolor. So I'm comparing what I see with that, trying to get them to look similar. And then I'm going to go down to the 3 controls to adjust what he is looking at. Pan moves left and right, so it's just moving his eyes left and right. And with tilt, we'll make the artist look up, effectively moving the image down. And in and out is field of view. Now I'm going to adjust this until I'm satisfied that I think it's close to what I see in the watercolor, and then I'm going to take a snapshot. I then go into PowerPoint where I already have an image of the watercolor. I'm going to paste the snapshot of the Google Earth image over it, and then I adjust its transparency so I can see both images, and you can see that the 2 images do not align. So I then go back into Google Earth Studio, I make some more adjustments, and I repeat this process. And I may iterate on this 3 or 4 times, or I may iterate on this 300 or 400 times, depending on how complicated the image is. But I'm not going to do that here. I'm going to instead show you the final iteration, or the best alignment, which is where I believe the artist was standing and exactly what he was looking at when he sketched this watercolor. Now I'm going to overlay a snapshot of that best alignment on top of this watercolor, and I'll fade it in and out. And I think you can see how well it aligns if you look at the mountains in the distance and the shoreline and the hills. So this is the best alignment, which is exactly the same view that John Warwick Smith was looking at when he sketched the watercolor. But where exactly was he? John Warwick Smith's exact location is defined by these three values: longitude, latitude, and altitude. But how do you visualize that? You go down to tilt, and you tilt all the way to 0 so that you're looking straight toward the ground. And then you go up to altitude, and you go up so that you can see exactly where he was standing. Now, Google Earth Studio can also create videos. The very last frame of the video is exactly what we were just looking at, which is the best alignment. The very first frame is wherever you want to start the video. And I have two other points in here, two other noted frames, and that's just to guide the video wherever you want it to go. So I'm going to stop this video at the last frame, which is the best alignment. And then I'm going to fade the watercolor in. So now we know exactly where John Warwick Smith was standing and exactly what he was looking at when he sketched this watercolor titled Lake in North Italy, Lake Como.